Ladies and gentlemen, there we go. It actually works. The challenge of affordable housing, as the PS has mentioned, is bigger than, I think, all of us, And it's hard to speak after the PS because, like any preacher, he lifts you up to a point where you think he's just about to get to heaven, Then we have to wait a long time, But he's a colleague and he's also a former board member. So I'm just going to try and share our perspectives as Shelter Afrique, take you through the journey we've gone through as Shelter Afrique, and where we intend to go to. And we don't come and stand here and say we've got it right, or we have the panacea to resolve the affordable housing crisis, but we're making a difference. We're trying to do something. So, okay. You can see from the back, that looks like Africa, right? From the back? Okay, so maybe I'll take you through it because I think the writing is not very clear. Just a bit about Shelter Afrique, some of you know or may not know. So, Shelter Afrique is the only Pan-African financial institution totally dedicated to supporting affordable housing in Africa. As a result, and through the association and formation via the African Union, 44 member states pledged their support for Shelter Afrique. There's another 10 countries we need to put on board, but 44 member states, when I say pledge their support, they put in money. Currently, if you look at the share capital of Shelter Afrique, the actual capital structure, you'll see the audited financial statements for 2018, 106 million of shareholders' funds. We've put a capital call out for another 260 million. So we'll move from 10% of our authorized share capital of $1 billion to about 35.6% when we collect the 25.6%. It's important to understand how we are funded because that is the force or nature of how we are able to roll out products which any bank in Africa cannot roll out because we're getting equity capital into Shelter Afrique. Of course, our job as management is to find how we can leverage that funding to bring more funding into the business. So who are the 44 shareholder member countries? They're all the countries that we've shaded there in blue. That's the key color code for Shelter Afrique. So Class A shareholders, 44 member states, which make up 78%, and they are the member states. We have a Class B shareholder, which are the African developmental financial institutions, of which they make up 24%. 18% is made up of the African Development Bank. It's the single largest shareholder. Then 4% is made up of Africa Reinsurance Company. So what we've done is we've said we've got an over-concentration of shareholding being the member state, 78%. So we are currently going to be going on a drive to introduce the Class C shareholder so that we can, I don't know what the best word would be, but we would want to get to an ideal shareholding structure of 40% the member states, 40% the African development financial institutions, and then 30%, well, it's actually 20%, will then be Class C shareholders. Yes, there we go. All right, a bit about myself, thanks to Neil. He's explained it. Felt like I was in an interview and like, I want that job, But this is just to make you aware that when Ravi, Anu put everything together, you're sort of getting the real deal on affordable housing. So I'm not going to talk about that. This is what we believe has been the history of affordable housing in Africa. Most countries coming out with housing policies and land policies that were handed over from the colonial period, major housing initiatives, carried out on the continent, whereby, the newly independent African nations come up with different policies. Development largely ignored in a quest for political consolidation and resource control, and where there are housing initiatives, most housing providers was for the civil servant. I mean, you heard the PS talk about the pool of civil servants. Just the police force alone in Kenya is already a market for 130,000 houses. So it doesn't matter which country you go through, but there are different policies affecting some countries. This is not all inclusive or comprehensive, but I'll just touch on the key points. So you find that in Uganda it's gone through 3 phases. The first phase was hampered by political instability and civil strife. Therefore, there was low implementation, there was no focus. Then 1986, we saw a more stable, consistent implementation. The goals of housing policy over this period were to provide sufficient residential land and plots in the urban areas. 1992, you're coming through a more comprehensive period for housing policy. You have the National Shelter Strategy, which is being rolled out, whose overall objective was to improve housing conditions and ensure adequate shelter of Ugandans by the year 2000. I have to stop and just remind you when the PS talked about 50 million shortage of housing. Sometimes when you look at the figure, it's large, but it's concentrated in a few countries. So if you look into Africa and you say, okay, countries with more than 17 million housing shortage, most of you will know that is Nigeria. That's why that is a key market for Shelter Afrique. Then you say, okay, fine, let's look at the countries that have got maybe shortages of 3 million and above. You start to see countries like Tanzania, interestingly enough, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then you go lower down and you say, okay, those with 2 million shortage and above, you start to look at Kenya, as the PS has said, look at Madagascar. In Madagascar, interestingly enough, you also have in that role South Africa, etc. You go to 1 million, etc. So this is just not all inclusive, but these are the countries which we've had a look at a high level. So you look at Cameroon, also you look at 3 periods under review. The first phase of the government policy placed emphasis on direct construction of houses by the government with a view to improving the housing stock. And I think what we picked up from the PS today is that, like in South Africa, where they produced 4 million houses for the low end of the market, government alone cannot deliver housing. And I think what you pick up from Kenya is that they are providing an enabling environment to be able to roll out large-scale affordable housing. The second phase of that, you see rapidly accelerating urbanization, which was largely unplanned for, and equally accelerating demographic growth. And then during this period, government embarked on strengthening the institutions that underpin the provision of these services. The third period, which is current, is devoted to reassessing the habitat agenda in the light of the increasing poverty during this period. I mean, 40% of the population living below the income poverty line. So Cameroon has seen the government change their housing minister. They brought in a lady who used to be governor, Madame Cortez, and she was successful in her spiel as a governor. Now she's heading up the housing, and she's got big objectives in terms of rolling out affordable housing. So we work very closely with these ministries. Nigeria, okay, so I guess we all know, or we all get interest in Nigeria because of the size of the economy. The first stream was from 1982 to 1990, where the policy was focused on addressing the prevailing quantitative housing deficit. Very little was achieved. Then you have the second stream of Nigeria National Housing Policy, which was 1991 to 2005, a period that witnessed a very comprehensive and ambitious housing policy. The policy was noted for its decided focus and sweeping reforms on the housing finance sector. And then there was a focus to rejuvenate and strengthen the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria into a wholesale bank, and also establish primary mortgage institutions. Third policy strand was 2006 to date, has focused on the use of the private sector as the fulcrum of the new policy. What is fascinating about Nigeria is they formed a fund for $1 billion funded by the World Bank, where they want to roll out a large-scale affordable housing. It's called the Family Homes Fund, and we are looking forward to working closely with them in terms of the delivery of affordable housing in Nigeria. For obvious reasons, 17 million housing shortage and more. Then you've got countries like Swaziland, where the first generation of housing policy was focused on turnkey joint venture arrangements and encouragement of the private sector to develop the rental housing more easily and available housing finance. I think what's key is now the second generation, which we see succeeded by new housing policy in the year 2000. This later is benefiting the outcome of the second United Nations Conference and Human Settlements Habitat 2. Swaziland continued. These are the objectives which are within their housing policy, which is improve access to land with secure tenure for those households seeking to house themselves, support for the development of property market through access to finance, identify and safeguard the rights of both landlords and tenants. I can go on and on. I'm sure Ravi will provide these slides, but I think what I'm going to do is highlight the key points. So what does history teach us? Okay, so most policies had an exclusive urban focus and a non-consideration of the rural areas. Generally, the rural areas are ignored. Housing problems will not be solved by government throwing money at the problem. Housing itself is a political affair and susceptible to political changes. You'll find sometimes if you hear there's civil strife, even in South Africa, it's always about service delivery. It's always about housing. People want housing as a basic need, as a right. And tweaking housing policy without addressing land policy won't yield very much results. So where are we today? I'm pleased to report to you that the United Nations actually, held their General Assembly here in Nairobi, where they invited 191 countries. We were focused on the 44 ministers of housing that came, had a cocktail with them to engage with them on how we can improve the delivery of housing. They formed the new urban agenda, which was adopted by the United Nations Conference. And the focus there is the new urban agenda represents a shared vision for a better and a more sustainable future. If well-planned and well-managed, urbanization can be a powerful tool for the sustainable development for both developing and developed countries. The Africa housing finance market has the following identifiers. Housing finance in Africa remains critically inaccessible for most people. I mean, you will know, I've worked in banks for quite some time, ABSA, Standard Bank, most of the big banks in housing. You get 100 applications for the mortgage lending. You probably find out of 100, you only get 5 that qualify, 5 to 10. Why? Because of the usual problem of affordability. So the PA said the problem is the supply, but the supply will say the problem is the take-up. How do we get people to become more accessible? How do we get housing finance to get more accessible to the normal mwananchi? Financial institutions, microfinance banks, commercial banks find it difficult to raise cheap funds for long-term commitments like construction. The sector of the economy most in need of housing finance are unbanked. Of course, we have the issue of property rights and security, which are needed for a thriving housing sector. So most construction companies and developers in Africa are keen on the high middle income market purely because they're making more money and they don't focus on the low end. That's why governments have to provide incentives to be able to encourage that. So I think at a high level, as I'm concluding, if you look at the numbers, 90% of Africans cannot afford to buy a house or qualify for mortgage, which I spoke about, 10% take-up rate. 3 billion people in developing world require housing by 2030. These are massive statistics, and you look at 62% of sub-Saharan African currently live in what is only described as swamp dwellings. These are stats from the World Bank. 97 billion is the combined value just of the housing shortage in just the two large economies, which is Nigeria and South Africa. And I'll focus on the 51% of urban dwellers that live in slum accommodation. Okay, this focuses on Nigeria, the 66,000 mortgage applications. The PS mentioned the non-performing loans. You find in Nigeria, these were 55% of the loan book. And then you've got in Kenya, as the PS mentioned, the 24,000 loans. Okay, so what are we doing to reawaken housing initiatives in Africa? Kenya, We've got the Big Four agenda. We work closely with the Kenyan government to find a way to support all the developments in terms of achieving the 500,000 housing units that need to be delivered. And then in Nigeria, we've mentioned what we're doing. Tanzania, we've formed the Tanzania Refinance Mortgage Company to deepen access of housing in terms of affordability on the demand side. And then in Central African Republic, where you find 2,000 houses were destroyed through the war. In Bangui and Bogoa, about 3,000, but we're doing some work setting up a housing bank there and also supplying housing through a public-private partnerships. And then in Rwanda, of course, we launched, I see the team is here from BRD, Regina, but we launched an exciting 3,000 project in Kigali a few weeks ago, which is purely focused on alternative building methods using aerated autoclave concrete, which reduces the cost to 30% cheaper. So we believe there's a need for a multi-sectorial housing finance strategy, ensuring effective legal and regulatory framework. In conclusion, we believe, the future we believe is looking at expanding mortgage finance, designing appropriate mortgage finance product, because the existing product that's been there clearly is not working for the target market. And of course, we talk of the blockchain technology that we believe is going to be, in a large scale, the panacea towards increasing efficiency in terms of the title deed processes. It could also be possible to add information about construction. Transactions can be done in far less time. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to continue. My time is out, but I just want to thank you for sharing this presentation with me. I just want to make it clear, if there's investors here, Shelter Afrique is out looking for investors in equity, including investors in terms of debt. Why? Because Shelter Afrique is that window into 44 countries within Africa. We believe we've improved our governance within the continent as well. And as a result, we have one vision: decent, affordable housing for all in Africa. Asante sana. I thank you.